folks. So we all set. Call this meeting to order. So I'm going to read this notice at item number 1. Due to efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 and to protect all individuals, council chambers at Town Hall will not be open to the public to attend council meetings until further notice. Members of the public wanting to participate in this public meeting may make a presentation to council remotely by submitting a delegation form found at www.orangeville.ca or to council and send it to council agenda at orangeville.ca by Friday, June 12th. Okay, that's a little too late. Call into the meeting to voice your questions or comments by calling after 7 this evening. And again, conference ID and phone number is there. Written comments may also be submitted prior to the meeting, can be addressed to the mayor, members of council, and or B Ward at orangeville.ca. I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa of the Three Fires Confederacy. This meeting is being aired on public television and or streamed live and may be taped for later public broadcast or webcast. Your name is part of the public record and will be included in the minutes of this meeting. Are there any disclosures of direct or indirect pecuniary interest by council? Seeing none, we'll move on to statutory meetings, and I'm going to turn this over to Deputy Mayor Andy McIntosh. Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going to put on my glasses here. I have to read the procedure we're going to follow tonight.
Okay.
Anyone who would like to speak to this matter is to call 1-289-801-5774 and enter conference ID number 47930-911, number sign. Callers will be invited to provide their questions or comments following the conclusion of the meeting and questions from council. If anyone wants to be notified of further consideration on this topic, submit the name, phone number, mailing address, email address to planning@orangeville.ca or call 519-941-0440 extension 2249. Reference the zoning bylaw housekeeping amendment file number Z1-20. So we'll start off with a presentation by town planning staff, Mr. Brandon Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here to bring up the presentation. Okay, so this is a housekeeping review and update to the zoning bylaw. To start off, over the course of time as we're administering the zoning bylaw, you come across certain challenges with interpretation or items that need further clarity or what have you. The last time a housekeeping review was undertaken for the zoning bylaw was done in 2014. Obviously, since that time, there have been a number of such issues that have emerged, and staff have therefore initiated this housekeeping review. Now, to do these housekeeping amendments, one has to follow the same process afforded by the Planning Act with respect to having a public meeting, which is why we are here this evening. Now, I will go through some of these amendments, some of the highlights, albeit they are somewhat technical and detailed. I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can. So one of the things we've encountered with a front porch is that they are permitted to encroach into a front yard setback to the main building. One of the challenges we've experienced is that the porch terminology refers to the porch having to have a covering. So therefore, when somebody wants to come forward with and construct a porch that doesn't have the covering, just a platform similar in nature but doesn't meet that terminology, they are not afforded that encroachment permission and then thus need to attain a minor variance for essentially what is otherwise intended by the zoning bylaw. So we're revising this definition to be a little more accommodating to different porch formats, a deck, etc., and hope that will clarify things for those individuals. Retirement home is another definition that over time has brought about some challenges with interpretation. It often is misconstrued with multiple dwelling. So what we've done is we've tried to elaborate on the definition to include more current sort of retirement resident formats, including the range of both assisted living, but also individual or independent living arrangements, and also including those communal facilities that one would expect with a retirement facility. So again, just looking to clarify that definition and ease with its interpretation. Bed and breakfast establishment is another definition that we thought would benefit from a housekeeping modification. We've had some individuals come forward looking to basically do the bed and breakfast format. Now keep in mind, they are permitted as a home occupation in single detached and semi-detached dwellings throughout the town. But again, as you'll see here, the definition specifically states the provision of meals. Now, there are some that, you know, they want to rent out the room or their living space temporarily, but they don't want to provide those meals. So essentially the same activity is happening, it's just in the absence of the meals. So we took a look at some neighboring municipalities for their definition terminology and discovered that it seems logical to have that flexibility in there for may include provision of meals. Training facility is another item that we came across whereby we've had some interest in some, I guess, more industrious means of training, whether they be truck training, heavy equipment, machinery, etc. As it stands right now, such an operation would be interpreted as a commercial school, which is only permitted in the central business district. Obviously, perhaps not the most ideal location for such a venture. So we thought it would be prudent to introduce a definition specific to this. And as you'll see later on, we've added this defined use within the general industrial area. So the slide in front of you shows a few additional use permissions we're looking to add in some of the commercial zone areas. Commercial school is being added to the neighborhood commercial zone. It's the neighborhood commercial zone already permits a range of uses that are similar in nature to this. Permits a nursery, for instance. So I thought it'd be appropriate to add commercial schools to that zone category. The next item is medical center. We're expanding the commercial zone areas of which a medical center is to be permitted, and that's because it's very similar in nature to the business or professional office, which are permitted in those various zone categories. The only difference, quite frankly, between the two is the professional office is generally limited to one practice or occupation, where the medical center includes a range of sort of disciplines under the same practice. Again, more in keeping with today's sort of format for medical treatment or physiotherapy, massage therapy, chiropractors, etc. And again, they'll all be subject to the same sort of spatial requirements, setbacks, parking requirements, etc. And then again, here's the training facility use where we've proposed to add to the general industrial zone. So second dwelling units is one that I might spend a little more time on this one, because I want to be clear that, you know, there's been some, I guess, question about looking at overhauling the second dwelling unit permissions in the town. Right now they are permitted in single and semi-detached dwellings. The focus of this exercise is really a housekeeping update to look at it more broadly. It would be prudent to have a more in-depth review of the matter and perhaps do its own standalone exercise. But that being said, however, there's a couple of terms that we thought it'd be appropriate to clarify. Currently, the bylaw states that a second dwelling unit can only have one entrance in the main face of the building, and that's for obvious aesthetic reasons. We just wanted to clarify what exactly constitutes the front wall of the dwelling, because there's been some interpretive challenges with that. And then the other piece is the parking requirement. Now, the bylaw requires 3 parking spaces for both the main principal dwelling and the accessory or second dwelling unit combined. Typically what we see is that's accommodated both with 1 space in the garage and 2 in the driveway. We've encountered over time a bit of an internal conflict within the bylaw, because it regulates driveway widths proportionate to the frontage width of the lot, and there's certain aesthetic reasons again behind why that applies. What we found, or have found repeatedly actually, is the numbers just don't sort of line up. And the reason is because the requirement for a parking space width being 2.7 meters times 2 gives you 5.4 meters. And for many of these dwellings, the maximum driveway width is actually 5.2. So that puts you at a conflict, and we've seen a number of minor variance application submissions come forward to address this issue. And that's something we would like to avoid if at all possible. And in doing so, we thought it would be necessary to revise the residential parking space width requirement to bring that down to 2.6 and make those numbers add up. We thought it's appropriate to do that because in a residential setting, you've got a little more control or elbow room perhaps with the parking of your vehicles on your property as opposed to, say, in a commercial setting. Here's some technical changes we've also made with respect to parking space requirements for the hospital. We thought it would be appropriate to modify that to be more in keeping with the more current hospital treatment environments. Right now, it's a per bed ratio. There's some content in the report about the numbers with respect to the current requirement being very, very low relative to what's supplied, and going with the per floor area ratio brings that up more in keeping with what you see there, but still it will allow for some flexibility should the hospital ever seek an expansion in the future. Another item we've added is a new requirement for visitor parking as part of any multi-residential developments going forward, basically condominium type multi-unit developments. Dedicated shared visitor parking be provided at a rate of 0.25 spaces per dwelling unit. This is a rate we found fairly consistent or in keeping with other municipalities we've surveyed as part of this exercise, and we felt to be appropriate to include that within the zoning bylaw. Accessible spaces is another one we thought it's necessary to amend, largely to be in keeping with the new Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act requirements. It is a little detailed. I won't go through this at great length, but basically the requirements right now, it's a proportion of whatever the zoning bylaw requires inherently for parking for any site. And with the new requirements, it sort of expands or elaborates on that, again, consistent with the AODA requirements. And there's also new requirements for an access aisle to be located beside the parking spaces and different types, a larger space for more of a van type accessible vehicle, and then your traditional accessible spaces. So again, all of which consistent with the AODA requirements. Accessible ramps is another element we've come across in previous circumstances whereby current terminology interprets a ramp as being a structure and thus has to meet the setback requirements of the bylaw. This has posed some challenges for individuals who need to have these ramps by an apparent or obvious need, and sometimes with the slope requirements and the placement, they're not able to adhere to those setbacks. So we want to eliminate barriers, and doing so, we've included terminology here that states they're permitted in any yard, essentially. Porches and stairs, again, coming back to the previous comment about the terminology around that. Currently, it's a 0.6 meter encroachment, not a tremendous encroachment. So we thought it'd be prudent to bump that up to 2.5 meters. What we found is some dwellings don't have enough room really to accommodate that 0.6 meter encroachment. So we thought it'd be appropriate to bump that up. That provision is also contained incidentally in the zoning bylaw. It is more commonly applied to the newer areas. We thought it'd be prudent to apply this throughout the town for consistency. Dumpster storage areas is another one that we've ran into some challenges with interpreting. So we thought it'd be appropriate to include some terminology to basically define the element, because previously there's been some challenges. Is this a structure or what have you, or is it a movable object? And it gives us something to look to if there's any question or scrutiny with any of these. So we've added some terminology to accommodate these on sort of a time basis, to give further direction about that. And finally, we've added a provision for access to rear yards for internal townhouse units. Essentially what this is ensuring that residents internally, they're not having to perhaps cart their lawnmower through their living room or their kitchen to their backyard to do maintenance and access of their yard. They'll have to either have an easement arrangement or some sort of design internally so they can pass through non-habitable dwelling unit space to get to their yards. There's been a couple of site-specific issues, one of which are some residents along Winterton Court, just based on their building design layouts. They've have rear yard setback, building setback, sorry, that match the rear yard requirement. but then they have sort of upper level walkouts that are above grade and need some a deck or what have you to be able to access their yards. And to do so, they need to seek relief through a minor variance application. It's just a product of the detailed design that went through the site plan process, and you know, when it was built and constructed and the grading took place, this issue was discovered. So we want to accommodate that by not, you know, requiring those individuals to go through a variance to build a deck to access their yard. So we wanted to address this issue as part of this housekeeping amendment. And finally, there's a couple of site-specific mapping corrections. This is the open space conservation block adjacent to Dinnick Crescent that's owned by the town. It's currently within the development zone category. We wanted to rezone that for its truly intended or existing use, being open space conservation. And similarly, there's a parcel of land adjacent to Montgomery Boulevard and to the residents on Morrow Crescent. Again, it's an open space recreation zone, and it really isn't for recreation purpose. It's more of a conservation area. So it's appropriate to rezone that and make that mapping correction. So this has gone through a consultation process, as you would expect with any amendment exercise. It's been circulated to all the required agencies. At this point, we don't have any comments or concerns from those agencies, and also we don't have any significant comments or issues from the staff circulated internally. So next steps, of course, is to take this all into consideration as part of our review and finalizing this housekeeping exercise, and pending the consultation comments we received tonight, we'll take that back into consideration and appear back before council with a recommendation for a final amendment for consideration. So that concludes my presentation. My contact information is on the slide in front of you. If anyone has any questions or what have you, feel free to reach out. Again, this is a public information meeting. It really is an information sharing exercise. It's part of the process whereby we take the questions and comments into consideration and move forward with a recommendation making stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Any questions from council in regards to anything on the agenda? Mayor Brown.
This is through you, Deputy Mayor McIntosh, to Mr. Ward. Under the retirement home proposed amendment, I saw in your due diligence with other municipalities, Oakville read to accommodate seniors or other special needs users, and ours just says seniors. I've been in some long-term care facilities where people suffering from debilitating disease that were much younger are in those facilities, and I'm just wondering if that amendment should cover other special needs clients. Can you comment on that, or did you think about that at all?
Certainly, to you, your worship. We did evaluate that, and we do have a definition for, I believe it's long-term care home within the zoning bylaw that does include those, you know, those other sort of care arrangements.
So retirement home is a different category, you're saying?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, fair enough.
Councillor Peters.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Ward, I'll just start with one. I assume we'll go sort of around the horn a couple times, but could you expand on the dumpster definition there? It's maybe not. It's a bit tough to interpret, I think, to most citizens that may come across that portion of the bylaw. So, are we saying the maximum amount of time you could have a dumpster is once for up to 30 days within a 6-month period? And then what would happen after that? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Through you, your worship, to Councillor Peters, that's correct. Essentially, we wanted to devise a term to encompass a dumpster bin, a storage box, if you will, and give some parameters around that. Again, we want to balance the needs of residents to be able to have these, to do what they need to do, but also ensure that the streetscape environment is kept clean and orderly and appropriate. And we want to avoid these from sitting out for prolonged periods of time. And this gives sort of a metric to, ensure that that happens, that they're truly temporary and they're not occupying the I say streetscape, but the driveway or, you know, out in the front of the building for an ongoing or even permanent period.
So, sorry if I could just elaborate. So would a citizen have to apply for a variance if they knew, for example, they had a 3-month renovation going on, and whether the same bin or multiple bins would be there over that duration? What mechanism is there for a citizen in that situation?
Through you, your worship, again, to Councillor Peters, presumably they would need to apply for a variance if it is going to be there for a more permanent period of time. Not to say, you know, day 31, you know, there's going to be immediate enforcement action, but it really is there for an intention basis. I would suggest that if it is there for a prolonged period, it does give the town the ability to take action as needed. And if they do want to have it for a longer period of time, they have the minor variance process at their disposal to embark upon.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Andrews.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. And just to piggyback on Councillor Peters' point, having gone through fire remediation, I understand the concerns that have been brought up by Councillor Peters, because again, you're in a situation where you're at the mercy sometimes of the insurance company, you're at the mercy of those that are doing the remediation, and there's always that timeline that could end up expanding 2, 3, 4, 5 months. So I think that, you know, the opportunity here within a timely fashion to communicate to the department obviously is important, but sometimes you're also at the liberty of the company that's doing the remediation, and they are also responsible. So I think the question that I want to pose is, you know, is the communication going to be going directly to the homeowner, or is the responsibility to the homeowner, or is it kind of a combination of those that would be involved with that particular initiative? And the other part is also those that might be in transition and moving, who have some temporary storage. There can be some delays, and, you know, the individual might be from out of town or moved out of town. So just look for a little bit of comment on that, Mr. Ward.
Thank you. Through you, your worship, to Councillor Andrews. It would be more upon the resident, I guess, to be mindful of the requirement. Again, it is more something for the town to give us direction, so we can, if there's an issue that arises with these, we have, I guess, more clarity with respect to what does it constitute relative to the zoning bylaw and what sort of framework is there for its existence. Certainly hearing the feedback and the questions being received tonight and the time frame is something we can certainly take a look at going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Post.
Thank you very much. I was very pleased to see that accessible parking spaces were on this list with the changes to make it reach the AODA standards. Now, with that being said, with these changes being made, will existing businesses and facilities be required to make these changes as part of this bylaw amendment as well? And if so, what is their time frame to have to make those changes?
Through you, your worship, to Councillor Post. With respect to the zoning bylaw, it would become a matter of legal non-complying if the site was established legally in accordance with the zoning framework that existed of the day. Now this is brought into place. They would, and it perhaps differed from what they're currently providing, they would be deemed to be legal non-complying with the zoning bylaw. Now that being said, however, I'm not certain as to their compliance with the AODA requirements. That's another entity in and of itself. I'm not certain about the grandfathering or present day applicability for that.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Brown.
Again, to Mr. Ward, through the Deputy Mayor. The calculation for visitor parking, 0.25. So I'm going to reference the townhouse project at 61st Street. I think there's 41 units there. So this requires 10 parking spaces. Can you tell us what is there currently? Is this a change from what was in that development, for instance?
To you, your worship, I would have to revisit the plans more specifically, but I believe they did, that development does contain a number of visitor parking spaces within it. The exact number, again, I'd have to double check. It is something.
It was low. It was low. I don't know whether it was 10 or 5, but it was low. Yeah.
I think 10 does ring a bell. Again, I'd have to double check that, but it is something where we've certainly been flagging as part of our site plan review of other applications, and we'll continue to do so going forward.
And as a follow-up, would this now apply to the Hanson development, which is rolling at this point? Or have they already committed to parking spaces and this would not apply to them?
To you, your worship, we did look at visitor parking as part of that because they're going through a zoning bylaw amendment exercise. We've been working with them to craft zoning provisions specific to that development, as you would expect with any planning application undergoing a zoning bylaw amendment. With that one, we did introduce some area-specific visitor parking space requirements. We did so for the apartment blocks. We thought it would be more appropriate for those blocks, as well as the stacked townhouse dwelling units as well. Different rates for both, presumably because the apartments will be a smaller unit size and have a little more difference or fluctuation in the unit size, and thus parking generated as a result.
Okay.
If I could just sneak in with a quick question. When you had one of those slides up, you showed Dinnick Crescent, and you were talking about the conservation area. Is that going to affect that new development that's hoping to start on Broadway? I know it's going to be coming to council in the next few meetings.
Through you, your worship, to Deputy Mayor McIntosh, it will not. Those lands are outside of the subject properties at 670, 690 Broadway. Those lands are owned by the town and are going to be rezoned as part of this mapping correction to recognize their existing and intended function.
Okay, so it's not good or bad. It doesn't affect it at all.
It does. Again, through you, your worship, it does not affect that development application. These are separate lands. It's a separate property.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Andrews, did you have another question?
Yes, I did, Deputy Mayor. Mr. Ward, and again, right back to the detailed information. And again, thank you so much for your report, and the slides tonight did provide a lot of clarification. But again, this is more out of curiosity regarding the porch density. That does not take into account the height of the porch, is that correct? And is there a provision, or is there a bylaw defining how high a porch? Not to say that somebody's going to build a porch taller than their house, but you never know. Architecturally, someone may have a design that they like, and so more out of curiosity.
Through your worship, to Councillor Andrews, the porch definition doesn't have a height restriction within it. I know that there is some differentiation with respect to decks between more of a ground-oriented element versus anything above that now falls within a deck and has to meet setbacks accordingly. The porch as it stands, it does not include a height requirement. However, that is something I could look into more carefully going forward, just to give further clarity to your question.
Yeah, when I was reading that particular part, I was thinking about Councillor Sherwood, who, if I'm not mistaken, sits on the Heritage Committee, and I know that some of our period homes here may have a certain aesthetic look, and you never know that a new owner may want to do something a little more dramatic. And again, there would be certain processes that would have to be applied. But thank you very much for your response, and I look forward to any other updates you may have on the height issue there.
Mayor Brown.
Back to accessible parking for a minute, Mr. Ward. If you look at the multiple, for multiple parking spaces, and it's just the calculation. When you go from 101 to 200, the number of parking spaces goes from 4 to 7 based on your method of calculation. When you drop into the 201 to 1,000, the calculation actually drops. So 200 parking spaces, you require 7 accessible parking spots. At 201, it drops to 6. So to correct that, the wording, I think, should be 3 parking spaces plus an additional 2%, which would keep you at 7 going forward. And the same thing goes when you drop to the next calculation of 1,000 to 1,001, although it's highly unlikely we're ever going to have 1,000 parking spots anywhere. But again, at 1,000 parking spots, it's 22. And when you go to 1,001, it drops to 21. And you could correct that if you went to 12 parking spaces plus additional 1%. So it's just a minor calculation error there, which I think you should look at. Thank you.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Ward, for your presentation. I guess maybe a comment question, if I could. One is, I really like the fact that you've added this piece about rear yard access for townhouses. There is townhouses in our town now that, by the way the fences are built, you literally have to carry a trimmer through your house. You can't get a lawnmower through there. It's a design flaw that I never encountered before, but makes sense as we go forward as a town and increase our density that this would be there. So I really wanted to thank you for thinking about that. And then the other one is just a minor clarification, if I may, Deputy Mayor, and it's regarding the site-specific provisions. And so we talk about the townhouses that are in the West End, and it mentions that moving forward, the way my interpretation of it is folks will apply for a building permit. That building permit will be received or denied, and that is the end of it for them moving forward, because many in this area are building those decks now. And you're right. I mean, you called out in the report that they've had to apply for the minor variance. So that's gone, just as a clarification. It's just a building permit and off they go.
Through you, Your Worship, to Councillor Taylor, it would be a building permit submission exercise. With that being said, mind you, all building permits are reviewed for compliance with the bylaw that's in effect. For those permits to go through under the current or the proposed language here, the bylaw has to be passed, and it's got to go through its appeal period without any prospect for appeal. Once that happens, and if there are no appeals, the bylaw is in full force and effect, and individuals may file for their building permits based on this amended zoning framework.
So if I may, Deputy Mayor, so once this is cleared, that's the new process, is what you're saying?
Correct. It would be reviewed based on the proposed amendments contained herein.
I think that's excellent too. So thank you, Mr. Ward.
Councillor Peters.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Ward. Just, I guess, if we could have a brief discussion on the parking counts in general and some of the metrics that are being used. As a bit of background, I see a ton of both large-scale residential and commercial development, and the parking numbers are all over the map across municipalities in the province. So I don't always think professionally that municipalities necessarily get the right numbers for a given situation. Not saying that's the case here, but just, you know, there's quite a variance. So what I wanted to get at though was that these are all minimums, is my understanding. And so if we look at something like the hospital or the visitor spots, or even broader sort of metrics used for parking in the zoning bylaw, to me a lower minimum is always better, because you're always allowed to go above that. But if we want, if on the flip side, you have some municipalities with very, very high minimums, and that ends up resulting in development with more parking than it needs, because it doesn't necessarily tailor to the situation. So I think in general, the building owner, developer, whatever you want to call it, landlord, is going to have a sense of the amount of parking that they need. And in general, lower minimums would allow more flexibility in that regard. And so when it comes to, for example, the hospital parking, I know you had several examples in there, but the 1 per 50 square meters of gross floor area, again, if that was 1 per 100, it lowers the minimum, but it doesn't actually prevent the hospital from building more than that if they so choose. So I guess my comments in general is that a lower minimum is better because it allows for more flexibility. while preventing the case where overdevelopment occurs, and obviously the trouble that goes with having large expanses of pavement and unused parking spots, that kind of thing. So I'd be curious what the rest of council thinks, but I think if you're only going to set the low bar, it might as well be as practically low as it can be, and then let the development sort of decide where they take it from there.
Okay. Mayor Brown.
Yeah, following on Councillor Peters, I guess you're thinking about climate change, the fact that vehicles are going to be used less and less as we go forward. Public transit's going to be increased. Things like that are going to require personal vehicles maybe to be fewer than right now. Is that correct, Councillor Peters?
Yeah, I mean, through the chair, I just think how people use transportation and how we optimize the use of our land. Parking is critical to many developments, but I don't think anyone around this virtual table or even in the town at large would say parking is the best ultimate use of land. There's many, many ways we can use it, right? Which is why we are looking for things like underground parking and car share programs and public transit. All of these things translate to, what many people believe to be better land use in general. So I don't want to overprescribe how much parking we provide in town.
Good point. I have one other comment. Under yard encroachments, Mr. Ward, you have things like dog houses and dog runs. We're coming into a discussion about chicken coops. Is that something that we would add to this, or should we add it now and pull it out if we need to in the future, or is it needed to be discussed at this point or not? Just wondering.
To you, Your Worship, I understand that our clerk's division is going through an exercise to look at the chicken coop framework. And we did have a discussion as to whether or not that should be acknowledged in the zoning bylaw. And we felt that we want to make sure we're not introducing duplication between the zoning bylaw and the chicken regulatory framework that's being worked on. And we did see that as being more of like an activity as opposed to like a land use exercise.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions from council, do we have any questions or comments from the public? Anybody from the public out there?
There's nobody currently on the line from the public.
Okay. Brandon, did you have any comments from the public on these?
Through Your Worship to Deputy Mayor McIntosh, I have not received any comments from anyone from the public thus far.
Okay, do we need a motion for this?
Yeah, when it's turned back to us, Deputy Mayor McIntosh, that's when we'd have the motion. This is just a public meeting to review it.
Okay.
Correct?
Councillor Peters, did you have something?
Yeah, just a quick question through you to Mr. Ward. What's the expected time frame for this coming back? I mean, it obviously seems pretty simple and with no public comment. It's probably pretty quick. Just again, so if public have, I'm not sure if it's 2 weeks, 4 weeks, still to reach out to you, maybe we could make that information available.
Through Your Worship, we would like to perhaps move forward something back before council before the summer's over. Recognizing that albeit there's no comments thus far from members of the public or agencies, there are still some key staff departments we'd like to have some further discussion with, just for their awareness and insight, and also there's been some comments raised tonight that we ought to maybe take a closer look at going forward.
Thanks.
Very good.
Okay, then I guess I turn it back over to you, Your Worship.
Thank you. We're done. So may I have a motion to adjourn? Oh, wait a minute. What? Excuse me. Sorry, folks. Okay, we need a motion to receive Mr. Ward's planning report. May I have a motion to receive? Councillor Andrews, seconded by Councillor Taylor. All in favor? That was passed unanimously, Madam Clerk. Now we need a motion to adjourn. Councillor Taylor, seconded by Deputy Mayor McIntosh. All in favor? Councillor Post, you opposed? You want to stay on, or?
No, I waved my hand.
Oh. I didn't see it. All right. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. See you soon.
Have a great night.
Good
Have
night.
a good evening, everyone. Be safe.